Good morning, friends, on this very sunny day. We are going to have a talk this morning by our friend David Saunders, who titles his talk, Natural Law Party. If you're one like me who doesn't know too much about it, should be interesting. David.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ray. Yes. So I've had this going around in my brain. I have prepared some thoughts on Natural Law Party, but I've also been highly aware that we're in a very perilous situation worldwide at the moment. On a situation that's at the brink. And I had offered to Patsy the idea for to talk about World Peace Project, which is another thing I was involved in. So just to give you a little bit of background, which would work for any talk or any discussion. In the 70s, and 60s, a lot of people of my vintage who were fringe hippie, and I wasn't really fringe hippie, I was sort of straight. I was a computer science guy and I was working in a business, but I had sort of hippie interests, and a lot of people in those days got interested in things mystical, read up Alan Watts or the Divine Light Movement or Bhagavan Sri Bajneesh, and quite a few million people learned transcendental meditation in that time, taught by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was sort of known as the giggling guru and was traveling around the world and had inspired the Beatles somewhat. And in 1973, I think, it's a long time ago now, I read an article in The Guardian. It was a full-page article, and it had a picture at the top of Maharishi at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston with astronaut Rusty Schweickart. And I thought, oh, that's a bit sort of, what's a guru doing with NASA? And at the bottom, there's a little picture of Maharishi with the Beatles, and it said, Britain's 20,000 meditators have kept a low profile since the Beatles episode. And I thought, oh, so the meditators thought that the Beatles' flirtation with gurus was a bit strange. So maybe there's something in this. And I read this whole page article, and it talked about meditation as being something simple and natural that you could practice, that it produced scientific benefits, that it was being practiced by people in all walks of life. And as you can understand from full page up, there's a lot of material in there. And I read it from beginning to end, and I thought, there's something here. I'm not interested in all the other stuff I read about Hindu nonsense and mysticism and claptrap, but there seems to be something practical here. They're claiming that this is simple and natural. It's not a cult. Anybody can practice it. Doesn't need a belief system. So I learned, as did probably quite a few Quakers, because people with leanings in one direction or another for change in society or inner experience, a lot of them found something of benefit in learning to meditate. Now, I was quite surprised by what I found. Almost immediately, I found I was enjoying life more. I felt clearer. I had more energy. I was fresh, and I was thinking, why aren't they teaching this in schools? Why didn't I learn this somewhere else? Why have I had to find this for myself? And I found myself drawn to learn more. Not everybody did that, of course. Lots of people were learning the meditation, practicing it 20 minutes morning and evening, and totally happy with that. But I found myself drawn in, wanting to learn more about the tradition that meditation came from. What was the technique? Where did it come from? Why did it work for me? Did it work for other people? Is this out of the blue? Is there a tradition? They obviously don't use this in India because the society isn't, and so on, right? I just wanted to learn more. And over the course of the next, so this was in 1973. And a couple of years later, I took a 6-month sabbatical from my work and actually came back to start a new job. But the 6-month sabbatical I took was in Switzerland and France, and it was learning how to teach this meditation, which of course involved a lot of extra practice in meditation and lots of lectures from Maharishi about what meditation is, how it works, how it applies to different areas of life. What is human potential? The segment of the teacher training course that I found most interesting was one called Higher State. Sorry. Are you all right there? Sorry, I'm wondering if to mute people. Yeah, the segment that I found most interesting was one called Higher States of Consciousness. And this was very much about, so who's talking here? Christopher, you're doing something. No, you're muted. Oh, everybody else is muted now. Cool. That's what Christopher did. So I gradually started to find that meditation could apply to all areas of life. Maharishi had actually founded a university in America, Maharishi International University, and it had this massive, fat, thick prospectus where the faculty had applied an understanding of consciousness, just the understanding of the knower, right? The difference between this university and any other is that you go to university to learn a topic, right? I want to learn about chemistry. I went to university to get a degree in chemistry. And I didn't go to a single lecture in that time about me as the person who is learning. I went to loads and loads of lectures about chemistry. And at the end of it, I was tested on those lectures and I got some kind of degree. And Maharishi International University is about the knower. It's about you. It's about expanding the container of knowledge, experiencing the boundaries of the container of knowledge, if there are any, and there aren't. And it was also about the process of knowing, how we go about learning. So and of course it's about knowledge, but it was also in every field of knowledge, attempting to relate the knowledge that we find on the surface in our subject to its usefulness in society and to the deepest laws of nature that knowledge comes from. So I'm probably a weirdo, but I found that fascinating, that it was opening up dimensions of learning that we just didn't approach in our universities. And I didn't study at MIU, but I found myself, I moved to America. I went and I was still a techie and nerd, deeply involved in microcomputers. I went and lived in Silicon Valley for 7 years. But at the end of that, I moved to Fairfield, Iowa, to the campus of Maharishi International University. And I did courses on the side there, and I worked as a carpenter for 3 years. And then I came back to England with having absorbed a bit more about meditation and how it applied to different areas of life, particularly healthcare. At the time I was there, Maharishi had started reviving knowledge of Ayurveda, which is the ancient Indian system of natural healthcare. And it wasn't at all trendy at the time, but he had collared an Indian doctor who was practicing Western medicine called Deepak Chopra. And he sort of said, look, I want you to tell people about Ayurveda. And Chopra was a really good medical student. He was a really good doctor. And he went back home with his wife after he'd met Maharishi. He said, look, there's no way I'm going to do this. It will destroy my reputation as a doctor if I try and introduce Indian natural healthcare. No way I'm going to do that. But the next day he flew back to meet Maharishi in Washington and said, so what would that involve? What do you want me to do? And he became very well known as introducing what became initially known as mind-body medicine. And I remember I met him once and heard him talk many times. And at one point he said, well, you know, Western doctors, he said 94% of Western doctors don't believe in mind-body medicine. How do they imagine they wiggle their toes, right? What he's saying is that the mind is connected intimately to the body, and there must be a connection. So gradually, through little taking time out from my working life or as part of my working life, I learned more and more about meditation, not just as something that I was practicing myself, but as something that had an application in other areas of society. And I found myself living in 1992 in a meditation community. The meditation movement had a small community in Lancashire in a place called Skelmersdale, where they'd been able to buy up, they'd been able to get some housing cheap, they'd been able to get some land inexpensively, and they had built a dome, a meditation center, where people could meditate and practice yogic flying and things like that together. It was a much smaller group than I'd been in America. The group I'd been in at Maharishi International University had thousands of people in the community. And I'd moved to the community in 1976, I think, 86. At a time that Maharishi had been saying he wanted more and more people to go and live there and meditate together. And he said, when enough people are meditating together, America will find itself without an enemy. Superpower rivalry will dissolve and creativity will increase in the world. And I thought, well, that's all very well, but I'm going to go and live there anyway. I had I discovered that I couldn't progress the project that I wanted to do in Silicon Valley. And somebody lent me a van, a Volkswagen bus, and I drove across the United States to this meditation community. And whilst I was there, the numbers gradually grew over the 3 years. And all of a sudden, and during that time, Gorbachev was speaking quite eloquently about opening up the Soviet Union, right? And creating an opening, Glasnost and Perestroika was the name. He wrote a book, Glasnost and Perestroika, and one of them was about openness, and I forget which was which, but one was about openness and the other was about restructuring. And he was talking about creating a more creative society and restructuring the Soviet Union. And then one day he was invited to a meeting by Boris Yeltsin in Ukraine. And Yeltsin announced that he wanted Russia to become independent. He wanted Ukraine to become independent. And a number of the Soviet states wanted to become independent. And this was a bit of a surprise for Gorbachev, but he was up for it. And so the Soviet Union broke up. And we were sitting in Fairfield, Iowa, in the meditation domes saying, this is what Maharishi was talking about. America hasn't got an enemy. The Soviet Union is coming apart. Gosh, what's that all about? And Maharishi actually said at the time, he said, this isn't the end of just communism and capitalism might be enemies, but they're two extremes of the same thing, materialism. They're both materialist. And materialism is opposed to spirituality. And it was quite clear that he was interested in seeing a society based on spirit, not based on material. And he said that the Russians may have independence and freedom, but they're not going to be fully settled. They don't have the experience of peace in their hearts. And I came back at the time that the Berlin Wall came down, and I was just bemused by all these things. You know, there was obviously political change in the world. Maharishi was saying that the job was only half done at best. There was more to be done. And shortly after, and so in 1992, there was a general election. You know, I can't even remember. I should have researched this a little bit more thoroughly. I can't even remember who the parliamentary candidates were for the two major parties. But the Times published an article. I should look this up. Can somebody look up 1992 general election? But it was the year that the Natural Law Party was formed. That was, to me, the big point. I'm gonna have a quick look here in Safari on my other computer. 1992. I should. UK general. Who won? What was happening in 1992 UK? John Major's Conservative Party, Labour Party made substantial gains. So the newspapers were saying there isn't a really good choice. It's a choice between two evils. And there was some kind of meeting of meditators organized in the Albert Hall during the run-up to the election. And I was, I thought, Albert Hall, that's a bit big. Maharishi is probably going to be there. And it turned out he wasn't. It was, but there were all the great and the good of the British TM movement were there. And the leader of the movement, one Geoffrey Clements, was called off stage at one point, and he came back and his face was kind of white, and he said, I've just been talking to Maharishi and we're going to form a political party and fight this general election and offer the people a choice. And so you can imagine the surprise of all the people who were at this event, that the founder of their meditation movement had taken it upon himself in a phone call, right, to call the leader of his movement in the UK out of a meeting of all the meditators, announce this and send him back to the gathered throng. So, and this was not long. This was, in my mind, I've got 28 days. It really wasn't very long. Can you form a party? Can you get candidates? But what happened was the meditators in the meditation centers around the country put themselves up, and the teachers put themselves up as candidates. And we fielded about 300 candidates, which was quite extraordinary. I can remember coming out of meditation one morning, probably a day or two after that, and a mate of mine saying, "Here, David, what do you think we should be doing about this?" And remember, this was in Skelmersdale near Liverpool. And so I thought, well, all the great and the good of the TM movement who are living in this community, they're going to go and pick seats in Liverpool, you know, or try and persuade the Beatles to stand or something. And I said, well, we should probably, why don't we try and organise a few people for the seats in Manchester? Well, how many parliamentary seats in Manchester are there? I have no idea, neither have I. Well, we found out that there were 30, and we rummaged around and found meditation. We actually organised 29 candidates for the 30 seats in Manchester, which is wildly improbable. And then the question is, what's our platform going to be? And it turned out that we did have, we were going to have an election broadcast because we got a bunch of candidates. I've got the election broadcast somewhere. Share screen. I don't know if it's going to work even. No. There's something that's not letting me. Safari. Yeah, screen share's not working. Well, I will put a link to the Natural Law Party's election broadcast, but it was like very 90s, right? There are all these lovely people talking very correctly about the Natural Law Party improving the economy, improving education, bringing out the best in individuals, creating peace, creating a military that can bring peace, creating an economy with more creativity, developing an education that brings out the knower better than the known, that improves students' grades. It turned out that we'd got something to say for pretty much every area of life. And this wasn't too much of a surprise, because at one time, Maharishi had talked about the idea of a world government based on what he called the constitution of the universe. You know, so it's like, you know, what do we believe in the British Constitution? The answer is, well, a bit. But he was saying the constitution of the universe. And the constitution of the universe, it turns out, you know, so if you look at the Bible, it says God created man in his own image. Well, at one point, Maharishi was saying that the Indian Vedic wisdom system, the Vedas, which means just simply truth, are actually not man-made writings and not necessarily something, commandments handed down by God, but the Vedas are the laws of nature in the form of vibrations at a subtle level in consciousness, and that they are cognized by the Vedic seers or rishis. A rishi is somebody who can peer into the life of things, as our poets would say, as Wordsworth said, with an eye made, it's in lines composed above Tintern Abbey. Wordsworth talks about seeing into the life of things with an eye made silent by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy. And meditators really love that verse because it alludes to the experience of meditation and experiencing subtler levels of nature. And the point was, the Vedic rishis thousands of years ago peered into the life of things and cognized the laws of nature that make the universe, that make the human body. And there are 40 branches to the Vedas, 40 sets of Vedic literature. And at one time, a physician who was working with Maharishi, a guy called Tony Nader, had a good look at the human physiology as he understood it as a physician, and at the Vedic wisdom system. And he basically found a one-to-one correspondence between every piece of Vedic literature and the functioning of the human nervous system. So it wasn't just that God created man in his own image. There was a sort of, and how. Look, here's a big fat book that explains how each piece of the Shiva is seated with some of the items associated with him as described in the Vedic literature. So actually, what we read about as gods and stories about gods and demigods are at a subtler level actually talking about structures in the human nervous system, the blueprint. So our body is made according to this divine blueprint, which is structured in consciousness. So the motto of Maharishi's University, which is a tree surrounded by the words, knowledge is structured in consciousness, which is one of the cognitions of the Vedic seers. It's in Sanskrit, Richo, Akshare, Parame, Vyoman, but knowledge is structured in consciousness. So this is what we were talking about, really. We were trying to talk about at the Natural Party, Law Party, in the 1992 election. And of course, we were seen as the quirkiest of oddities. We got some attention in the media. It was, the people who do the yogic flying, the hopping, how weird are they? How weird is this? But there was quite a sensible program one evening, which was exploring different voting systems. It was actually exploring the idea of, what do we call it? The way that we vote for Europe. Proportional representation, right? Why don't we have a fairer voting system? And they featured the party political broadcast of the Natural Law Party as a group who are trying to introduce new ideas in politics. And I'm going to stop in a moment, but the actual platform to me was much less interesting than the point that they were saying, when you vote, you are voting to support continued conflict. In our parliament, what you have got is you have got one party and you've got another party. They're sitting on opposite sides of the aisle, and what they spend a lot of their time doing is fighting each other. Is presenting ideas from one side, presenting ideas from another side, and opposing Her Majesty's loyal opposition. But you are basically paying people to oppose each other. And if you look anywhere in the scriptures, you very quickly find a house that is divided shall surely fall, right? And we have at the core of our political system, a house that is divided. Isn't that sad? And the idea, one of the ideas from the Natural Law Party was that instead of having political parties, we should have meetings in our constituencies. We should have groups who are interested. Let's have a group that's all the people who are interested in education. And instead of what you have is you have your council and you have your councillors, and they discuss education amongst themselves, and then they form some kind of policy perhaps, and they instruct officers, might be in an education department or it might be elsewhere in the council. They instruct officers to administer an education system. The officers are developing policy which goes over to the schools system. Kids go to school and get educated. And actually, our education is a sort of system of Chinese whispers. You get to vote for councillors who talk to officers whose principal interest in life is keeping their job, anything for a quiet life. And they're looking at the councillors and saying, well, there'll be a different lot in 4 years' time. My job is to keep things steady, keep things in balance. I'm not going to do what I'm being told. I'm just going to keep things on an even keel. And the officers in the Education Authority are talking to the schools and keeping a system going that's somehow being chopped and changed by government, public schools, grammar schools, comprehensive schools. Students are getting an education, and the idea of the Natural Law Party was, why don't we bring all these people together in one place and have a dialogue about how we want our schooling to be with the teachers and the councillors and the Education Authority, and decide what we're going to do. Now, there absolutely wasn't time to get that idea across in the 1992 election, but this was what was being proposed, a much more participative form of government, that you would have a group for education, you would have another group maybe for energy, you would have a group for justice and policing. And each of those groups would elect 2 representatives to a central council. So there might be 10 groups, there might be 20 people on this central council. And who would chair the council? Well, it would be your member of parliament. So your member of parliament in your local constituency would be your prime minister, right? They wouldn't just disappear off to Westminster and not be seen until the next election. They would be there to chair all the meetings in which you were figuring out as a constituency how you wanted to do your education, how you wanted to improve your place. And they would be taking those ideas with them to Westminster. And which party would they belong to? They wouldn't belong to any party, not even the Natural Law Party. The idea was that the constituents, the people in the constituency, would choose someone who they felt would be their best representative, not from a party slate of whom Labour or the Conservatives or whatever thinks will best represent, well, you know, will be their best yes person for the Prime Minister and the government. That's who you get to vote for in an election. You get to vote for somebody who your party, maybe locally, but maybe nationally, has put on a slate for you to vote for. It isn't the person who you as a constituency feel is going to best represent you. And I thought this was the best thing ever. I thought this was great. And of course it didn't happen, but I've got a little book here. 6 years later, John Prescott, 2004, yeah, I don't know how that happened, because anyway, after John Major, yeah, Tony Blair got in, right, a few years later. And John Prescott was both Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for the Environment. And there was a lot of talk, and Tony Blair and Ed Miliband formed a Department for the Environment, right? And they helped form, who was it? Jonathan Porritt's think tank, a wonderful think tank that Jonathan Porritt set up. It's so far off that I don't remember what it was called now. But John Prescott thought, how are we going to form sustainable communities? And he asked Sir John Egan to do a review of skills for sustainable communities. How can we change education so that we end up with a system that's going to create sustainable communities? And Sir John Egan came back with when the Deputy Prime Minister invited me to undertake a skills review, the focus was very much on the professional built environment skills necessary to deliver sustainable communities. Professional skills are vitally important, but simply upgrading these in isolation will not, I believe, deliver the outcomes the government is seeking. So John Prescott came back and said, you can't get there from here. And here's why you can't get there from here. Our planning system is so completely wrong. You have a planning system that is set up to field applications from developers. We're not planning our cities. Developers are putting forward planning applications, and councils are, as best they can, trying to make sure that they're not too harmful. They will be rejected if the council considers them to be really harmful. And what we need is a planning system. And this is what John Prescott said. He said, what you need to do is bring together the councillors who are interested in planning, and the council's planners, and the developers, and the landowners, and the public, bring them all together. Sounds like the Natural Law Party, doesn't it? Bring them all together in one place and decide how you want to do development in your city, how you want housing to be in your city. And then, and this is where Sir John got really complicated, once you've done that, you do it. You've figured out what you want as a group amongst yourselves. No more Chinese whispers. You've got a plan of what you want to do. And of course that didn't happen. It didn't become popular. But some years later, when I arrived in Bristol, I was working for a developer, Martin Connolly. And I talked a little bit about ideas for creating sustainable communities. Martin was housing Bristol's homeless. And he was saying, the system is completely broken. It's so badly broken, it's just not true. I'm a developer and I know that putting in applications is awful, but the whole housing system is wrong. Since we sold off council housing, there isn't a route out of homelessness anymore. You may be homeless. If you go to the council, and it's interesting, this really happens in Bristol. If you went to the council's housing department and you opened the door and you came in and you said, I'm, and you're about to say something beginning with they would say, no, you aren't. We'll tell you if you're or not. And then they would interview people and they would decide whether they qualified to be homeless or not. Because the government had targets for homelessness. Because the governments had targets for homelessness, councils had to try and keep it as low as possible. So they assessed people for whether you qualified for being homeless or not. And that included when, at times when they were doing surveys, they'd go around looking for rough sleepers. And the definition of rough sleeping was sleeping on the streets. And the definition of sleeping with on the streets was your head on the concrete, not your head on a piece of cardboard. So they're actually able to do audits that said we've got fewer people homeless than you'd think. So this is how awful our housing system is. And this is what I've been exposed to for the 10 years, 12 years that I've been in Bristol. The awfulness of our political system and the agencies that we run that are supposed to serve the people. And I've had this tiny piece of exposure to, and this is the point, that when Maharishi was putting together the manifesto for the Natural Law Party, it wasn't based on a long history of our party does this or our party does this or they believe this. We've got to come up with something that's the opposite to it so that we can fight them in Parliament. It was a, what would be the best way to run our society based on natural law principles? And he came up with these ideas of participative democracy, actually, a shift from representative democracy to participative democracy, an end to political parties that fight against each other for power and control in the country, and the empowerment of communities to do what they want for themselves in their communities and have those ideas represented in Westminster, in a national government, by the person who they felt would represent them best. I throw up my hands in horror because we don't have anything remotely like this. And, you know, some years later, I came to Bristol to, you know, well, what is all this democracy about? You know, what is society about? And I'd been thinking about sustainable communities ever since before Sir John Egan. And my mate Martin Connolly said, well, could we do something here? Could we create a centre of excellence? Sir John Egan wanted a number of things. He wanted this participative process. He wanted some example communities that were built much more by the community than by developers. He wanted centres of excellence in sustainable communities. And the government did set one up in Leeds. And Martin said, couldn't we have one here? And it turned out that a university, Plymouth, was selling off a campus in Newton Abbot. And Martin said, could we build a centre of excellence in sustainable communities there? And I said, I've no idea. I very much doubt if the university want to sell it off to become a competing educational institution, but you know, if you're up for it. And so we bid to purchase a university campus, a former agricultural college in Newton, former Sealhane Agricultural College. And what we created a document, half of which was about how you would build a campus based on totally educational, sustainable values. And part of it was how you would teach just a few simple subjects. We didn't want a complicated environmental university. We wanted a grounding. We wanted to create an education that gave young people a grounding in sustainability. And we came up with a simple diagram, which you would think I'd be able to find, since this is a document that I was intimately connected with putting together. I'm going from page to page and it's coming up with a diagram. But basically it said, we're going to teach about energy, sustainable energy. We're going to talk about building housing that is sustainable. We're going to talk about education itself. We're going to talk about communities themselves, how you run community process. So housing, energy, community, the environment, how we build a better built environment. Oh, and the big one, of course, how could I not remember this? Food, because we were actually looking at an agricultural college. We wanted to teach food. And it turned out that the staff who were the college was being shut down, the staff were going to be made redundant. They had a vision for what they wanted to do. They didn't have any resources. We'd got 3 million quid sitting in a fund that was available to make purchases if we came across something that we liked. So we offered 3 million quid for the place. Unfortunately, the Duke of Buccleuch offered 12 million. And then withdrew the offer because he discovered that he wouldn't have been allowed to build ordinary housing on the land. The planning guidelines for that area said it had to be educational. So we went in and said, we want to build an agricultural college, an environmental college. And they said, great, you want to put up more buildings? Fantastic. Student housing? Fantastic. But here you've got staff housing and you said commercial housing. And we went, well, yeah, because, the staff would want to buy homes and we want to build them places to live, but they'd be really real eco homes. And they said, yes, but commercial housing, the site's not zoned for commercial housing. And we're a bit naive. And we said, yeah, but the staff have got to live somewhere. And they said, well, yes, but is it really commercial housing? Or are you talking about staff housing to support the educational application. Right, and we went, hang on a minute, can you say that again? Staff housing to support the educational application. And we went, yeah, because we wouldn't allow commercial housing, but we would allow housing to support the educational application, right? So we adjusted our proposal, of course. And when we went to talk to the council, actually we talked to the Chamber of Commerce and the council. The council said, adjust your, this is what you need to do to get planning permission. We went to the Chamber of Commerce and talked about what we would like to do. And there was a guy across the table from us, and he was leafing through this document. And eventually he said, well, I've looked all through this document. It's very interesting. And you mentioned the Co-op Bank here, and you mentioned Triodos Bank. I haven't found a single number, and I don't really know what you're thinking of doing with the place, but I'm going to finance it. And we saw jaws dropped. And he recognized from reading our proposal that what we were saying was viable. There was something there that would work. It would be popular. It would meet a need. And he thought it could be, from his experience as a regional manager of a major national bank. I won't mention the bank's name, but it's a name that you will recognize. He was regional manager of a big national bank, and he had the power to say, I'm going to support this project. We'll fund it for you. We like your proposal. He'd seen development proposals before. He understood that the numbers would be in a separate document. And so this is the point. When the community, and we had formed this, not on the basis of a developer, but on the basis of going and talking to the people in the community. It was a community vision. That's the point. We had said, we can do an Egan review process from the point of view, if the councils won't do it, and they didn't. Sir John Egan actually in his review of skills said, councils won't get this, they won't understand it. Eventually, we will have to have remedial education for councils so they start doing planning properly. And it hasn't happened, and we're still not doing it. And it needs to be done, not just for housing, but for education and for justice system. We don't need a punitive justice system, we need a remedial justice system. All of these things that we know that different parties have got a little piece of, but fight each other over, we need to decide over lovely cups of tea and cakes and buns, right? How we want our communities to be in community centres like Quaker Central, or actually like Hamilton House. I was involved in setting up a community hub where we thought about how we want our community to be, out of which there is now a land trust, a community land trust being formed for Stokes-Croft. So these things are happening incredibly slowly, but they are starting to happen. And the vision for the Natural Law Party was to create a party that would self-destruct. Once communities had adopted these kinds of processes, once larger communities, and what I wanted to start today was, I want to talk about something completely different. I want to talk about world peace. And the reason I wanted to say that was because just this morning, a newspaper announced, now I wonder if I can share a screen. No, it just says Safari app, and I can't find the right one. But basically, David Lynch, the filmmaker, is setting up a fund, a $500 million fund to create large groups of meditators at university, a group of 10,000 in India, a group of 10,000 in America, and 10 groups of 1,000 at affiliate universities around the world, where these students are practicing mastery of natural law and meditating together to create peace. And the point was, when communism collapsed, when I was living at Fairfield, Maharishi International University, it was with just 1,600 people, which was a magic number. It was the square root of 1% of the US population. If, gotcha Ray, If you had a larger group, it would be big enough to flip the world from materialism to spirituality. And there are large groups of students meditating together in Bolivia now, and in the name's gone, country next to Bolivia in South America, Lima, Peru, Bolivia and Peru. I was trying to think of a country starting with I and I couldn't get there. Peru. In Peru and Bolivia, street children were taken off the streets by a priest, given food and education, and eventually given meditation as well. And when they started teaching meditation, the behavior improved and the grades improved remarkably. And this priest, who was a friend of the current Pope, started introducing it in the school system in his city. And there are now thousands of schools in school systems across Bolivia and across Peru who meditate together morning and evening. So this wave is coming, but it ain't there yet. And obviously we've still got this awful, awful war, and we do need peace. So I've gone over more than I should have done. I hope there's something of interest in there. I was going to come up with one of my slideshows where I put lots of slides up, but I think the precise policies of the Natural Law Party are not of interest. It's the idea of shifting to local participative democracy, as thought up also within the Labour Party and not yet practiced. That to me is the biggie. I would love to see all the parties adopt this, so that you have both Labour and the Greens and the Lib Dems and the Conservatives saying, let's get together and decide what we want in our communities. So there you go. We haven't got a lot of time. We can probably go a few minutes over, but does this make sense that we change the way we live in our communities and we change the way we govern ourselves so that we run the government, not we fight it? Somebody talked about what we've got now, the difference between rule of law and rule by law. And we're shifting from rule of law, which we all used to respect, to rule by law, meaning the government will issue edicts and you're expected to live by them. But those edicts are for us to enforce. And that seems terrible, terrible, terrible. And we need to get back to what are the principles that we want to live by? And can we run our institutions by those principles? And so John's saying, it won't work with the current rule system. We need a new way of living and working together.
Thank you, David. A lot for us to think about there. One being a quick thought of mine is, if you could deal with it fairly quickly, is what happened to the university?
Yeah, well, the Duke of Buccleuch didn't get to build it there. He offered far more than we did, so we lost our bid. And he withdrew because he wasn't going to be able to build housing there. And they did a second round, and we were no longer sitting there with our 3 million because the financial crash had happened. So we had bad timing. It was bought by a wonderful charity, and we had wanted to work with a charity and to work with kids who were disadvantaged on the campus because there was spare housing. And a group called the Dame Hannah Trust, who worked with kids with cerebral palsy, bought it as a new centre for them. And they called it Working with Children of All Abilities, not Disabilities. And it's beautiful what they did. But unfortunately, they blew their own budget. They weren't able to keep it going. And it got sold off again. And now there is housing being built on the site. And didn't get used. But we're now talking about, well, look, with the budget that we've got to get carbon neutral, which is around somewhere between £4 and £10 billion, some of which will be spent on people. Why not have a bunch of those young people be learning about sustainable communities whilst building our sustainable community? Why not have a Bristol-wide apprenticeship scheme for all the people working on creating a sustainable city? So the idea lives on, but it just needs to morph and land in a different body.
Anybody else?
Needs to reincarnate. And I've been working on that. Every time one thing falls flat, I find something else to work on where it's the same ideas, either sustainable communities or spiritual communities, or ways to educate people where they work together more effectively. And there's lots of ideas in business about creating learning communities, pioneered first of all by a professor at MIT, and more recently by Otto Scharmer, a German educationalist who became a professor at MIT to develop his theory U. Susan, you're all muted. You may all become unmuted and say what you think would make for a better politics. Susan.
Well, I was just thinking, I admire your tenacity. As someone who's been trying within a small community of only about 120 people where I live to get some more sort of democratic way of working. I mean, we are a block of flats of older people, but lots of decisions are made that affect all of us. And I've been struggling for 6 years to make the whole thing more democratic and just failing dismally. So I do appreciate, and I feel very depressed about it also, I do appreciate the fact that you carry on and on and on. And I have to say, I do think that there's a lot to be said for meditation. I was a devotee of Guru Maharaji.
Yeah.
And I drifted away rather than withdrew when I left Bristol. And I had some issues with that, but the meditation was life-sustaining.
Yeah, I think, you meet graduates of all the different gurus. I think the point is, if you're studying, the whole point of being with a guru is to get to the point where you're kicked out of the ashram. Because if you're kicked out of the ashram, that means you're ready. Maharishi said he kept the people who were dangerous around him. And at one point, I had a bit of a run-in with the community in Skelmersdale, and some of them suggested it would be far better if I found somewhere else to live. And I discussed this with a wise old lady in the community, and she said, "This is happening because you're strong enough. The world needs strong people out there." And I thought, so I left the community with good grace, wondering what I was going to do next, but something always comes along. And yes, I admire you, Susan. I mean, it's out of these things where somebody looks at something and says, I could do something about that, and just starts picking up litter, or, it could be anything. And people start to become active in their communities and then seek routes to do it. And then eventually end up with a political party and bashing their head against a wall. But we all sense that better is possible in the world. I never stopped believing that was true from the moment that I read that Guardian article, because when I read that, I thought somebody's figured this out. You know, I'm pursuing that. At that time, I was pursuing the life of a nerd because I liked computers and I was good at them. And I was actually, at the time, I was an election agent for Labour in the northeast of England. So I was trying to do a bit in politics, but failing. And then looking and thinking, no. Here's somebody who's got a plan. And Morrissey had a world plan. It was to create an ideal society. One book I didn't show you, this Creating an Ideal Society book. You know, he did his blueprint, just as, you know, Sir John Egan did his This Is What We Need, and we did our Ideal Community book. If enough people keep bashing away, eventually nature responds. Eisenhower actually said, the people have been asking for peace forever and ever. One day we may just have to give it to them. He knew that governments are not the people who create a peaceful world.
Any more questions?
So,
Graham.
Graham.
I heard some years ago of an organisation which is promoting the teaching and practice of meditation in schools. I don't know how far it's progressed, but my first question is, do you see that as a step in the right direction? It might be associated with peace education and the creation of a system in which quarrelling and bullying in schools is dealt with, at least initially, by a peer group or individual peer students who will intervene in a mediation role and consult both sides in the quarrel or the bullying problem. Associated again with that is coming back to teaching meditation. Is it like a religion where you can teach it in a neutral way by a teacher who does not themselves believe in its value and does not practice meditation? Is it valuable to have a person like that teaching meditation to students?
It's lovely. There's a lot of points there, which I will try and answer quickly so that Ray's blood doesn't start to boil or his clock doesn't start to explode. The transcendental meditation movement and other meditation movements have taught meditation in schools, and pretty much. I mean, Krishnamurti. There's a lovely Krishnamurti school in this country, and I can't think who else does this. But the TM movement organised a primary and secondary schools associated with their community in Lancashire, and in fact, the biggest source of people moving to the community was people coming because they wanted their kids to go to the Maharishi school. And at one point, one of Maharishi's top men, Maharishi never visited Skelmersdale, but one of his top men, a brahmachari called Nand Kishore, came to the community on a visit, and they were all, oh, we've got a Maharishi school, isn't it wonderful, we're teaching meditation. And he tore them off a strip. Boy, was he rough on them. And his point was, you shouldn't have a Maharishi school. This should be in all the schools. Why are you keeping it to yourselves? This is wrong. You shouldn't be in some little enclave. This needs to be out there. And so, the guy who got it right, I think, was a TM teacher, a meditation teacher in in South America who basically had a chat with Maharishi. Maharishi sort of pushed him in the direction of getting it going in schools. And it's really taken off because they're noticing that education attainment improves. I take your point about having it taught by a disinterested person who's neutral, but actually learning to become a teacher of the meditation and to help people practice it properly involves learning, learning the meditation. You don't necessarily have to be particularly advanced. I mean, I've been meditating for 2 years or so when I became a teacher. And, and Maharishi got criticism for this in India, why he'd got these ignorant Westerners teaching our beloved tradition. And his comment, which is a bit salutary for us, he said, in a war, you give everyone a gun. And the point was, you teach everybody to meditate, whether they're, whatever their level of spiritual attainment. And the point is, we have lots of kids who are coming in who are radiant and who meditation just helps, lift. It's like having a Scalextric railway and just lifting the engine onto the track and applying the electricity, they go roaring off. If you give them the wires to connect directly with the cosmos, and people very quick. And this is, we're working with a machine that we don't come in with a manual. We know how to get up. We know about waking and dreaming and sleeping. We have no real understanding of higher states. Poets talk about it. You get a Shakespeare or a Blake or a Wordsworth talking about real potential for humanity. There's more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamed of in your philosophy. Well, we need a practical philosophy that teaches us that more in heaven and earth. And that's what Maharishi set out to do. He set out to understand. He studied physics at university. He wasn't a little, devotee at an ashram. He found a teacher, said he wanted to study with him, and the teacher said, what are you doing? He said, I'm at university. Finish your studies. Don't come to me until you're qualified. So he studied Western science and trained with a spiritual master, and then brought out the abstract techniques, cleaned up of the religion. So it became science of creative intelligence when he started teaching it as a theory of consciousness. For Westerners, it was called science of creative intelligence, not Hinduism in disguise or Vedic science. The leader of the meditation movement in America at the time, a lovely man called Charlie Lutz, who sold concrete and steel for a living. And somebody at a meeting said, isn't transcendental meditation Hinduism in disguise? And Charlie says, do I look like a Hindu? Fantastic. So that's the point. The point is that the religions often have a real fire in them, as I believe was true of George Fox. I was attracted to Quakerism only partly by the good works that Quakers do, but actually by the fire that Fox had, his spontaneous state of higher consciousness that he worked for, and achieved. Maybe to continue in some way, some future occasion.
I don't know. But as the time has come, friends, like many good things, we have now come to the end of their time. So thank you, David, for your, as I said earlier, interesting chat. That has left us with many questions which we don't have time for answers for, and maybe there weren't answers, but there you are, me rambling on there. But next week you have the debatable joys of myself, who will be regaling you with a few interesting, amusing and colourful, I hope, poetry.
Great. Well, I look forward to that. Thank you, everyone. It's been really,
Thank you, friends.
Bye.
really great having a chance to talk with you.